And we're live.
Great. Thank you, Ogiek. Welcome, everybody joining us on Facebook Live. Thank you for joining us. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you're joining from. So my name is Samrawit Guksa. I'm the Communications Officer with Minority Rights Group International, based in London. I'm here today joined by two amazing guests, Mr. John Sironga, who is the chairman of the Ogiek Council of Elders, joining us from Kenya, as well as Lara Dominguez Rush, who is part of the strategic litigation team at Minority Rights Group and one of the lawyers working on the Ogiek community's case. So just to give a bit of an overview of why we're having this conversation today. As many know, the Ogiek are the indigenous and present owners of the Kenya Mau Forest. It's their ancestral homeland, and this was recognized in a court of law, the highest court of law in Africa, the African region, the African Court for Human and People's Rights, forgive me. And they won this historic case in 2017. Their rights were recognized, their right to the land was recognized, and the decades-long evictions against the community from the Mau Forest were declared legal. And the government has been, since then, required to implement this judgment. But that was 3 years ago. That was 2017. And I wanted to start asking Mr. Sironga, can you tell us, as a representative of the Ogiek community of the Mau Forest, what is happening to the community right now? What's the situation?
Of course, the things which are happening within the community on the area which we live, which is Eastern Mau, is actually very difficult to the community because the multi agencies committee is working on their role and dividing into pieces the land that we want in order to benefit other people, and our people is really scared. So as far as that, if we go to the nearer to them, they just warn us not to come up to where they are working. So the community is scared and they know nothing. And up to now, that is why they requested the petition to go on.
So, Mr. Sironga, can you just guide us a bit more for those who might not be familiar with the case from the last 3 years? Would you say the government has taken some steps towards implementing the judgment since 2017?
In fact, the Englishmen say that justice delayed is justice denied, because as of those 3 years and even a half, the government has appointed task forces which were just using money for the sake of their own. But up to now, they have not brought back or bring what they find through the task force. So up to now, task force is not report is not released. And what we are seeing is that they want to use their own way of implementation, because the regional commissioner called us in a meeting on 19th at Naivasha, What they did, actually, we did not, we were not happy to it, because they went into the chamber, and after all, they come without even involving us what they were talking of. And when they come, the cabinet secretary said that we want to implement Mao on Ogiek case. So everybody will be given 5 acres, which we did not request them. What we knew is that we could have our land as a community. And after all, we are seeing that they want to force this implementation in a way that we are not happy. So up to now, after all, when the media came, they ordered them to go out. So we remain scared what they want to do to us, and that is why we up to now scared of.
Absolutely. And with these concerns, maybe I'll turn to you, Lara, if I can ask a bit more from the legal side. You know, a lot of people hear the word implement the judgment or the legal case, all this terminology. Let's break this down a bit, if that's okay. What does implementing the judgment meaningfully mean?
So I'll start in May 2017, the African Court on Human and People's Rights rendered a historic and landmark judgment in the Ogiek case. It's the first time the African Court heard an Indigenous rights case, and they concluded that as an Indigenous peoples, the Ogiek have a right to own their ancestral land in the Mao Forest, and that the government was wrong in evicting them, and that it was illegal to evict them, even in the name of conservation, which is the purported justification for these evictions. And as a result, I would say that implementing the judgment is ensuring that all of the different findings that the court made around the right to property and all the other rights and violations that the court found are remedied. And that means returning the lands that are ancestrally owned by the Ogiek to the Ogiek people, and ensuring that no further actions taken by the government or any other private parties infringe on their rights to their ancestral land. So I think that's, if that gives the clarification that you were looking for. But the only other thing I would add is that since 2017, we're in a situation where the government has not only failed to take any measures to meaningfully try to implement the judgment, but they've taken a series of measures that continue the ongoing violation of the Ogiek people's rights. And I think that's also the key point. It's not just non-implementation, it's continuing violations of the Ogiek people's fundamental rights.
Thank you, Lara. Yeah, that explains a lot. Let me ask you both a bit about this task force. So as I understand, the Kenyan government formed a task force whose job it was to outline how the government should implement this judgment, really giving the steps to make it a reality. The task force was supposed to release a report about this. Has that been released? I ask you, Mr. Sironga.
Of course, they appointed the task force trying to implement what is not there to us, because we are finding that as the case went on in Arusha, the way of which was to implement it is to say, okay, of Mao to be given their ancestral land. And as to us up to now, we see that all things are not going well, and instead we have just tried to 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 request to see whether this implementation will be done in a way which, of course, uh, is not going well. So task force, to us, is doing their own. Even the report is not out. Even what is going on, we don't know, because we approached the regional commissioner. They said the report of task force was not was not well done. And I don't know why the government is there to finance for task force which cannot approve what they are doing. So we request that report to come out, then we see whether it is implementing Ogiek case of Arusha.
Absolutely. But as I understand it, I did see that this report was shared with the Cabinet Secretary of Environment, but as you say, it wasn't shared with the Ogiek. Lara, is that correct? And could you guide us, shouldn't the Ogiek have been consulted throughout even the formulation of the report, or at least once the report may have been finalized?
Completely. And I think although the task force members did have some meetings with the Ogiek community to receive their views, which was an improvement from the first task force that was created that ended within a year without doing anything. The issue here, I would say, is that the task force report and all of the measures that the government is taking purportedly to implement the judgment involve measures that basically involve the Ogiek people's ancestral lands. And as Indigenous peoples, the Ogiek have a right to be meaningfully consulted about any decisions that are taken concerning their ancestral lands. And they also have the right to free, prior, and informed consent with any decisions that are taken involving their ancestral lands. And this is really at the heart of what Indigenous people's right to self-determination is. Ancestral lands are critical to their survival, to their material survival, and to their survival as Indigenous people. So to their right to culture, just as the court found, it's not just the right to property. It's the right to culture, the right to religion, the right to natural resources, the right to development, all of these fundamental rights that are tied in with ensuring that the Ogiek have ownership of their ancestral lands. And so any decisions that are taken to implement the judgment and to remedy the violations that the court found necessarily has to consult the Ogiek people and include them in the process as a whole, rather than what we've been seeing over the past 3 years, which is sidelining the Ogiek, not really listening to what they have to say, not consulting them in a meaningful way. And by that, I mean also the community as a whole. So not just a few hand-picked representatives, but actually creating a means by which the government goes to the Ogiek people across the Mau Forest Complex, because there are several communities that live across this very vast region, and ensuring that all of their views are meaningfully consulted and that the community is informed about what the government's plans are. Because up until now, there's been a complete lack of transparency about what the government plans to do, a complete lack of information, sometimes of misinformation. And in that sense, it's really on the government of Kenya to do a significant U-turn on the course it's sort of taken over the past 3 years.
And sorry, for those joining on Facebook now, you're joining a conversation with Mr. John Sironga, a member of the Ogiek Council of Elders, and Lara Dominguez-Rush, a member of our legal team, who's working on the Ogiek case, amongst other lawyers. And myself, I'm Samroit Guksa from Minority Rights Group. So Lara, you touched a bit about on the process and this kind of speaking with the community as a whole, as opposed to individuals in the Ogiek community. So today we were expecting, President Kenyatta to hand out private deeds to land in the Mau Forest. And I know, Mr. Sironga, you touched upon this at the beginning of this call, but maybe you can go into more detail and describe to us what this means and what is happening right now in that. What does this mean for the community?
In fact, this violating the community because as we won the case in Arusha, Tanzania, the matter was to be given our own title of community, because community, we have windows, we have vulnerable community, and now they want to mix us with other people. This will not make the community favor what they are doing. So we request to this that we want one title to avoid grabbers, to avoid vulnerable community members, because we know in this time or in this time, we have so many clever people who may undergo and take or grab one another land. So we want community land, because in every clan we have in Eastern Mau, it comes, every person knows his people and will guide them in a good way. So we request this will not favor the community of Eastern Mau to us.
And, Lara mentioned before that the process or the communication by the government and the various ministries, it hasn't been very clear, it hasn't been transparent. Could you tell us a bit about how you feel about the process? Has it been transparent, or do you feel that the community is being misinformed or misled in any way? I believe you're on mute, Mr. John Sironga. Yeah.
So to us, this is not will please the community, as even this is meaningless to Ogiek community. So this was done in a transparency order, and we request all this to be banned, because it will not assist us, or will not, as we understand ourselves that we are indigenous community, and we want to prevent cultural, to prevent religion, our religious, all the way of festival and everything that pertain to the indigenous community. We know up to now that we, as community, we were just flora and fauna community. So up to now, they want only to dilute Ogiek community into other tribes. So that is why we went to the court. So we are saying this is not transparency to us.
Absolutely. And you mentioned the flora and the fauna. So I am going to ask a question about the Mau Forest itself. Many people are worried about the environment and biodiversity of the Mau Forest. they question whether the Ogiek are the best people to protect it and prevent it from further destruction and degradation. Can you explain to us why the Ogiek are the best protectors of this forest?
Okay, when we talk to flora and fauna, this was just made by the God at the beginning, this community to follow their system of living, their system of food, and whatever. So to us, we find that it is not good because, as you know, you can't take a fish from the river or from the dam, then you go and dip it into the open land. So this is not good to us, and that is why we are being making noises of what the government is doing.
Lara, I'm going to turn to you here as well, because I'm aware, as many are, that there's a lot of conversation and debates about what the best approach to conservation is, to protecting the environment. Do you agree that Indigenous peoples are the best custodians of the environment? And if so, why?
Completely. I do believe that Indigenous peoples are the best custodians of the environment, and now there's an increasing body of evidence that shows that Indigenous communities are the best environmental custodians. And importantly, that Indigenous forest dwelling communities like the Ogiek, when they're given ownership of their community forests in collective title, that those forms of conservation, Indigenous-led, Indigenous-owned, basically recognizing their ancestral rights and assisting Indigenous communities in securing those rights and enforcing those rights from outside encroachment. When that happens, those community forests fare better in terms of conservation outcomes than state-owned protected areas and forest areas. So I think it's really important to underscore that, and to also point out, Indigenous communities have been preserving their ancestral lands for future generations for thousands of years, if not longer, since time immemorial. And it's no coincidence that 80% of the remaining biodiversity on the planet today is in lands ancestrally owned by Indigenous peoples, even though they own only about 20% of the world's surface. So I think that really speaks to that historic track record. And so really, when we're talking about conservation, we need to have conservation approaches that put Indigenous peoples and local communities at the center of that approach, that secures their customary tenure rights as the foundational premise of the entire model, and that listens to what Indigenous communities have to say. One of the reasons why their lands are so rich in biodiversity is that they have vast repositories of traditional knowledge. And so conservationists around the world that are working in areas where there are Indigenous communities really need to listen to what they have to say about their lands and about the best way to conserve it. And in that sense, it shouldn't be about coming in and kicking out a bunch of Indigenous peoples from their lands because we need to preserve it, but about really approaching Indigenous communities and asking them, how can we support you in conserving your lands? So the entire model sort of needs to change. So I think that's a really important point. And the only other thing that I personally would like to underscore, which Mr. Sironga, which John was talking about, but in this case, in Kenya, the Mau Forest has been gazetted into a public forest land and is under the custodianship of the Kenya Forest Service. And it's under the government's custodianship that most of the forest has been destroyed. A huge amount of the forest canopy has been destroyed. And yes, to underscore that it's under the Kenya Forest Service. And the African court even found that the Ogiek couldn't be blamed for the environmental degradation that's taken place on the Mao. So I would say that the Mao forest needs to be returned to the Ogiek people because that's their right as indigenous people for the Ogiek people, but also for the good of the forest, to preserve it for the rest of Kenya and for the rest of the world, really.
Thank you, Lara. We have a question that came in for, oh, sorry, Mr. Sironga, please add.
As what you asked me to tell about is that Ogiek people are indigenous people, and they were able to protect the forest for so many years. They could not kill animals all that way that people think of, but they were actually looking after them because that was their work, and even God created them to look after the forest and everything that is in. So every community was to guard its lineage of forest, and even to guard everything that is happening. They could negotiate. This is not good, this is good, and therefore we were able to protect for so many years. It is when later, when other people, communities come into the forest, that everything was got distracted in the forest, because we used the honey, we used everything, and when these people came, they cut the trees for beehives of orchid, and when we go to report, we are told that is not illegal. So Ogiek community, even now, they believe that forest should be protected, should be guarded, should be done whatever. And we even now, when we fight the forest is being distracted, we tell the government, and even Chaco, which is being burnt there, we go and destroy. So we are eager to protect forest if we are given mandate. So the community is aware that was their way of life, the way that God or nature gave them. So we are not happy for what is going on in Mao Forest.
Thank you, Mr. Sironga. Let's take a step back for a second and talk about the case and what's happening in the forest now. Next week, there is a key date where this will be discussed in court. I'm wondering, first of all, what is the Ogiek hoping to achieve next week?
Of course, our expectation is that we shall win the case, because we did not assume for what we are not, for what, because we know we lived it there for many years, and even the international communities are after us. So we are very much happy, and we know we shall win, as this was our ancestral land, and even God will give us power to win the case as regard. So myself, I'm very happy.
Great. We're following this very closely, and feel I'll turn to you, Lara, just to ask and explain to our listeners today, why is this whole Ogiek case so significant? Why is it really important for the government to take its implementation of the judgment seriously?
So the Ogiek case is a landmark case, that I mentioned before. It's historic. It's the first time that the African court has decided on an indigenous rights case. So its judgment is critical for the Ogiek people, first and foremost, for the Ogiek community, but also for indigenous and pastoral communities across Kenya, because it sets an important precedent about what the Kenyan government's obligations are vis-a-vis indigenous peoples more generally, but also across the continent, because it's a regional human rights court. So it's basically a finding on what government obligations are under the African Charter of Human and People's Rights. So in that sense, it's hugely important to indigenous and forest dwelling communities across Africa, and I would say around the world. It's very clear too, that conservation cannot be used to justify indigenous peoples who are not responsible for the environmental degradation that is causing governments to want to create protected areas and mistakenly think that evicting indigenous peoples and all human habitation is what's required to preserve those areas. So in that sense, that's a really important precedent. It's the first time that it's happened in the African context, and for that reason, it's groundbreaking, and it's so important for it to be implemented. As I said, first and foremost for the Ogiek people, it's what they went to court for, to vindicate their rights, but also for the environment, as we've been discussing. We're facing an environmental crisis, and it's really important that forests around the world are placed in the hands of the best custodians, in this case, indigenous peoples. And the other point, I guess I would just underscore regarding why it's so important to implement the case is that failure to do so really, I guess, calls into question the legitimacy of the very human rights institutions that were created to ensure that people's human rights are upheld. So it's important for everybody that's out there listening today around the world to really stand with the Ogiek today, and to let President Kenyatta know that we're watching what the Kenyan government's doing. It has an opportunity now to really live up to its human rights commitments and to implement this historic judgment and do the right thing by the Ogiek people. The tragedy or what's, I guess, so upsetting about this situation is that for 3 years, they've pretty much done the opposite. So while there's this announcement that President Kenyatta made that he would be handing out titles of individual title deeds in Eastern Mao to non-Ogiek as well, which goes completely against what the judgment says, I think that now that it's been delayed, I think there's an opportunity for him to put a stop to it, to tell his government ministers to put a stop to this multi-agency team and what they're doing, and to really stop and do the right thing and consult the Ogiek community and ask them what they want and grant them the community titles that they're entitled to under the judgment. So yeah, this is why it's so important.
Thank you, Lara. We had a question come in for Mr. Sironga, if I can relay this to you. The question is, what about the relationship between the Ogiek peoples and the wider community or the wider population of Kenya, so other people in Kenya? And what I would like to add on top of that is, do you feel that you have support right now? Or do you need wider support? Just explain this a bit to us.
Of course, we don't have support, but we are seeking. And whatever what you said is that we need a fair implementation. So we requested the court to stop and get a fair implementation. And if we can get or inform the president, because we know they are giving false information to the president. So if this happens, the president to understand, he will call us and tell us what do you want. Then we shall negotiate with the president, because this is not easy. We as the community, as from 1995, 1932, all communities were given their own land where they came from. But Ogiek were not given any portion, except they lived in that forest, and the government should understand that went up to there. So we want them to know that Ogiek are from Mao, and it should be given a full support and to get their portion within that Mao forest. So we thank you very much.
Well, thank you. I wanted to just explain a bit more about solidarity and why MRG and partners and ally organizations, why we're launching this campaign. For those who may not have seen this, yesterday on Human Rights Day, we launched this campaign called I Stand with the Ogiek. And it really speaks to the heart of this whole conversation about why the Ogiek are really in need of global solidarity now. As Lara mentioned as well, to let the Kenyan government know that we're watching its actions. And despite even all the distractions this year with the pandemic, that we won't just turn away and leave the Ogiek to fight this battle alone, a battle for their rights, which were already recognized in court. So this campaign, for those who may not have seen it, you can visit our website. It's minorityrights.org/Ogiek, where all this information is gathered there. We're asking for people to, everyone on this call, if you can, to just engage with this campaign. There are concrete actions we're asking of our friends and allies to do: engage in the conversation, engage in events like today's, where we're listening to the Ogieks and their voices, understand the complexities of this as well. Yes, please, Mr. Sironga, add.
Okay, as we continue talking through Facebook, we need people from other communities or organizations to support us, and even media. We need pressure from all other communities and even from other people from everywhere. So we, as a question, you have asked that when we meet president, what will you say? I will say that to implement what the case of African unity in human rights to be implemented as it is. Thank you.
Absolutely, yes. And we're looking for, obviously, solidarity for this message, to amplify your message, to call on the Kenyan government and President Kenyatta with the hashtag All Eyes on Kenyatta, to implement, as Mr. Sironga said, to implement the judgment of the 2017 African Court's judgment. We're approaching the end of this conversation, but I would close with one question for you, Mr. Sironga. A lot, this campaign that we're putting together, that we've launched now, it's asking for this global solidarity. And some of the people who will be showing their solidarity to the Ogiek community are listening to you right now on this call. What can they do to support you?
What I will ask them is to assist us in every way, in every occasion, so that this community overcome the problems that they are passing on through now. So we request solidarity and other communities within the world and even international, because we see it is very good to see that the community is well settled and come with a way of which they believe they are okay as other communities.
Thank you so much. With that, I think we'll close this event. This will hopefully be one of many to come. The situation facing the Ogiek community is changing rapidly every day, almost by the hour. So what we're asking everyone through this campaign is to please follow this. Keep your eyes on what's happening to the community. Show your solidarity. A hashtag is more than a hashtag. It's a real sign for the community that you're with them and you stand with them. For more information about that campaign, as I mentioned, please visit the website where we've collated all the information. We have social media materials there for you to use. There's a special designated newsletter which you can sign up to, which will be focused on the Ogiek's case, where we'll send you regular updates. And please don't let the conversation end here. Solidarity, thank you for joining. Solidarity, as I always say, it starts with listening. So I want to thank our speakers. Mr. John Sironga, thank you so much for your time today in explaining this to the international community and our followers and anyone who will listen. To Lara, thank you for waking up very early this morning and attending as well. And to all of you who tuned in, really thank you. And please don't let this be the end. Write to us if there's any information you need, clarity. Let us know if you want further explainer calls like today's. And we'll do our best to keep you all updated. So thank you so much, everybody. I'll end it now. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.